She was the first white woman to really claim these things publicly, to talk about the pathology of racism.
She is a radical, nuanced, incredibly unprecedented white voice in American history.
She understood that it was a stunted society because of race.
In my opinion, she was Jane the Baptist. She came early.
It was just great to see her named in King's letter that he wrote in a Birmingham jail, only because King was very critical of moderate whites. He was also very critical of liberal whites.
She was persecuted, she was oppressed, she was threatened, but she never backed down. She paid a heavy price.
Whenever anybody reads her, they say, "Why haven't I heard it before? Why haven't I?"
When I read her now, it could have been written yesterday. I mean, so I think part of her would say that's still going on, you know.
So I was in my early 20s by the time I discovered her, but immediately wanted to claim her as part of a genealogy that I needed as someone who had always struggled with the legacies of what had been a very pathological society, so racism and sexism that came out of the Jim Crow South.
I picked up Killers of the Dream and was just completely blown away. And I would sit down and I would read a few pages and I would just have to put it down. And I just felt like Lillian was answering so many questions that I have had. And she also was answering so many questions that I didn't know I had.
I'm reading Killers of the Dream, and she's talking about a South that I haven't experienced, but was around for my grandparents and their parents. And you still see the echoes and the ghosts that are left over from it. I just find it incredible how she's able to not only pinpoint these are the problems and they've been here forever, but then be so incredibly hopeful about it.
We see in her something that we needed to hear, and also we see in her the courage to keep on as we think about her today, that she is a resource. She has thought about these things. She's thought about the rationality behind them. She's thought about the fears that people have as they look at changing old patterns.
If she can do it that early on, when whites are not really looking at this stuff at all, certainly not psychoanalytically and phenomenologically, if she can do this, then certainly we can do it.
I wish we had more Lillian Smiths around writing. We do. We have Ta-Nehisi Coates, who is a brilliant writer on race and privilege, and he calls out everybody. We have writers like Paul Beatty, who wrote the wonderful novel The Sellout, a novel which makes everybody uncomfortable. We have people like Roxane Gay, who calls out people. She's got that kind of Lillian Smith style wit and bite to her work. This is a country that needs to get a grip on its history, needs to acknowledge its history and look hard at itself and do something about it.
In Forest, as in every community in Mississippi, there is segregation of the races. Drinking fountains are segregated. Restrooms are segregated. The local theater is segregated. Negroes sit in the balcony. There is only one swimming pool in Forest for white only.
Do you think that immigration will ever be a success in Georgia?
No, I do not. You have to take into consideration the way of life and the attitude of the people. And not to come in here and undertake to cram down the throats of people of this country any such concept of tyranny in government.
We will state that the pickrick will never become integrated.
Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
Are you with us in this fight? and the sing-song voices of politicians who preach their demonic suggestions to us as if elected by the devil to do so. Telling us lies about skin color and a culture they were callously ignorant of, lies made of their own fantasies, of their secret deviations, forcing decayed pieces of theirs in the region's obscenities into the minds of the young and leaving them there to fester.
She wanted change. She was ready to go right along with the young people, like change now.
So as a white woman, Lillian Smith is examining what it means to be raised within a context in the South under white supremacy. Her work, Strange Fruit or Killers of the Dream, is a disagreeable mirror that it holds up to white America. And it's then hard for white America to see itself. And that takes not only brilliance and insight, but that also takes courage to be able to articulate whiteness in this form.
Lillian Smith saw a society that was expending most of its energy on trying to keep separate black and white when it was impossible. They lost the Civil War militarily, and they knew it, but by God, they would win everything else, culturally, socially, legally. And we had politicians who were willing to go to any length to protect their privilege.
So Lillian Smith has this incredible honesty. She is the one who is willing to speak the truth to the structure of whiteness while facing death.
But the kind of bravery it took to basically say to your whole culture, your whole class, everything you were raised with, I don't accept this. This is wicked.
She just absorbed every experience she had and learned from everything and applied it to her own life and her own philosophy.
I was born in fabulous country, and I've always been so glad I was. On that edge of Florida, where it joins to Georgia, and where the great swamp is, one knew that one was walking on earth that was probably no more than a few inches thick, and all this was floating on water of endless depths, a depth that could never be measured. And if you stayed still, you would begin to sink. I was born in a land that is beautiful and terrible, broken into 1,000 pieces by its ideas and fears and hates and dreams and its passionate loves. Within the home and out on the street, strange forces drove the South's children close together and as ruthlessly tore them apart.
She said that she was taught to love God and to know that Jesus is God's son, and yet that she knew she was better than a Negro. She said that despite the fact that her mother taught her about what it means to love and to be gentle and to care, her mother still taught her to put Negroes in their place.
Well, Lillian Smith was brought up in a very privileged family. They were very educated, very cultivated people.
She could be Lady Bountiful, the whole thing. She credits her father a lot with saying, if you see something wrong and you don't do something about it, that's worse than a sin. Her father employed a lot of workers, black and white.
They lost a lot of their money in the First World War.
They moved to North Georgia because he had bought the mountain cabin as a vacation place. When they moved up there, they were not the rich people in town.
This was a big culture change to move up here.
Her parents somehow scraped together enough money to send her to Piedmont College for a year. At the end of that first year, she began to dream of going to Peabody Conservatory in Baltimore to pursue her love of music. But she had to earn money to make that possible, so she did all kinds of things. She worked as a maid and kitchen help at several hotels managed by her family, and she also taught at some of the local one-room schoolhouses. She graduated realizing that everybody else had more talent than she did.
She had an older sister and who had married Eugene Barnett, who was working with the YMCA in China.
And so Lil went and joined them in China and taught music in a school there.
She said, my eyes were opened. The beauty of it, the strangeness, the exoticism, everything about China. But then she saw
the real arrogance of outsiders who come and literally build walls to keep out the Chinese from their own public gardens.
That had an enormous impact on her because she saw the same sort of racism there that she had left here.
The walled cities, the walls become a major metaphor in her writing because it's literally true that when you wall somebody out, you damage yourself as well.
China opened her eyes to a whole other depth or dimension of the forms that life and relationships and the way people treat each other can take. She didn't want to leave, but she got word from Clayton that she needed to come back because her father and mother, their health had failed and they needed her. She said, I didn't know then I was coming back to Georgia for good. While Lillian was away at Peabody in 1920, the family decided they needed more income and established Laurel Falls Camp for Girls on the property on Screamer Mountain. Lillian stayed and ran it until 1948.
She was awfully young when she took over the responsibility of the camp.
When I think of the privilege of young Southern girls being able to go to that camp, because it was not like anything else in the South, what I wouldn't have given to have been able to go to that camp. The girls all came from families who had means because of the expense. And she said, we did have all of those ordinary competitive things like archery, horseback riding, games that the girls played, but they also did painting and theater and dance and all of the arts. And most importantly to her, the regular and frank discussion of human issues. They would just sit and talk about stuff and nothing was off limits.
Of course, I have a lot of biases because she was such a strong member of my family context too. But I don't think anyone was unaware of her presence. She was a daily presence. In first place, I mean, she was at every meal. And then she spoke to us so often at campfire and on Sunday morning, which was not exactly a traditional religious service, but was one that dug fairly deeply into issues. And she always led that. But she was just, I mean, she was walking around all the time, you know, we saw her.
I think she came to study psychology, psychoanalysis, Freud, Jung, and others, because she was trying to understand how to direct this girls' camp.
Through activities like the theater program she had, asking these young girls to question the world in which they lived, I think sometimes it made it more difficult for them to go back into those worlds.
It was small things, or they sound small to us, but when she made all of those young girls who came from very affluent backgrounds call black men and women Mr. and Mrs., this was not done in the South at the time.
She was integrating that camp. She couldn't have African Americans as campers. but inviting local non-white children to come up and play with the girls and eat with them and sometimes spend the night. This was in the 1930s in North Georgia. I mean, it's just, you talk about looking for trouble. But somehow, she managed to do what she needed to do to keep it okay.
I'm not sure that people knew that all these things were going on. The camp was outside of town, a mile out of town, up on the hill. It was kind of like, and you know, mountain folks were kind of like that. You know, you just go about your business and you don't mess in somebody else's a whole lot.
She's created this world that she wants to live in. She's created a place where she is in charge, and she has other creative, intelligent women working with her, and she's working for the development and future of middle and upper class women who are still expected to basically get married and raise children. In the early 1930s, Lillian fell in love. She fell in love with Paula Snelling, who was a math teacher during the school year, but who was a horseback riding instructor at Laurel Falls. Paula would eventually become a co-director of the camp. Later on, and maybe this was for the sake of public appearances, she was seen as Lillian's secretary. Paula was the first person in her life who held both her heart and her mind simultaneously. Because Paula was educated, they loved literature, but the thing about Paula, she said, Paula read what I wrote and encouraged me and gave her critical response. And she said of Paula, I don't know what I would have done or how I would have continued in those early groping days without her encouragement. She fell in love with Paula, so all the rules and regulations about why she should not do that, it didn't matter.
These women lived through McCarthyism. To say that you were gay, to be out, you risk everything. In some states, there were laws where you could be institutionalized, you could go to jail. To me, the fact that she did everything she did makes this even more incredible. That means she was even more at risk.
They were up there for good all year round. And she said, we could no longer get out into the world, so we decided to bring the world to us. And we founded a little magazine. She did a lot of writing for the magazine and recruited a lot of writers. Over the 10 years that they published it, I think she felt she learned a lot about the craft of writing, both from doing it herself and from bringing in all these pieces, reading them, publishing them. It did put them out in the world in a way that they could not have been otherwise. She took on the most powerful issues of the time. Imagine the flow of ideas that came in from their writers and what kind of powerful effect that must have had on her mind and her awareness.
She turned what may have felt like an isolated place into, you know, from an outsider's perspective, at times what seemed like a kind of salon, a salon on Screamer Mountain.
For her to basically ignore the laws of Georgia, which meant that she invited Black people to sit down at her table and have dinner.
Both times that I went to see Lillian, that was just my wife and me. She'd invite me to come up for weekends to be with her and Paula. One of the things that she kept saying and implying in some of her responses as we talked was that the South will change. It's inevitable. It was important to have someone who didn't look like me articulating the kinds of things that I was articulating. Yes, that was important.
People write and write, and all of a sudden it all comes together. Boom. This amazing story. Strange Fruit is so mature in its poetic language, kind of lightning bolt moments of insight in human behavior.
Strange fruit, raining down in this garden of Eden. Eating premature, it's the love that we needed. Flesh ripped apart, it's like a struggle just...
Children in anguish, white and Negro children forbidden to grow openly as human beings. They are the strange fruit on white culture's twisted branches.
We stay frozen at war like Greeks and Trojans. Temperatures rise, feel the heat like an explosion. Silencing our pain, we cry with no emotion. Eyes swollen with tears, we stay hoping. Back bent from the weight, we stay coping. Try to breathe through the pain, we stay choking. A better day on the way, we stay hoping. Oh yeah, there's trauma and pain, but we ain't broken.
Strange Fruit was a success, a huge success. But it was a success sometimes for the wrong reason. I mean, that it was a banned book. It was considered a dirty book.
There was a copy, on our bookshelf, but it was wrapped in brown paper.
Eleanor admired Lillian Smith's courage, and she did what she could to help her. Like, she made sure that Strange Fruit would not be impounded and that it could go through the mail.
Lillian said of her writing, I didn't start out to write this novel about racial things. She said, I look for the truth as I write, and I put down what I find.
The writers that we respect and enjoy and hold up as artists, a lot of the white ones were very, very scared, with good reason, of trying to inhabit the heads of African-American characters. Faulkner was very wary of that. He knew he didn't know Black people like they knew him. Lillian Smith tried something that was really brave, and that most of these writers, Faulkner, Harper Lee, she kind of tried, Flannery O'Connor on the margins. But Lillian Smith, I think, was just a braver artist in this way than they were, because in Strange Fruit, she really tries to imagine the lives of educated Black folks.
Ed had always hated the place, as if it was somebody. Once when he was 16, almost ready for college, he'd had one of his spells, sassed Mr. Pusey down at the store. If it had been any other white man in town, Ed would have landed in the Calabusa chain gang, or worse, for his words. But Mr. Pug Pusey turned and walked in the store without a word. And later he talked to Mama. Better get your boy out of town, Tilly, he'd said. The boy's itching for trouble. He's not a bad boy, just restless. Like a young billy goat, Mama said, pursing her lips.
Obviously, there were Black writers doing this all over the place. There was Zora Neale Hurston writing, Richard Wright, James Baldwin, Ralph Ellison, writing around the same time or a bit before. But white writers didn't do that, and Lillian Smith would have none of it. And I think that's Another reason she was very much ahead of her time, and possibly too far ahead of her time for her contemporary audience.
Lillian and her sister Esther, who was a drama teacher, actually wrote a stage version of Strange Fruit for Broadway. Unfortunately, the play flopped with the critics and with the public. This was a huge disappointment to Lillian, who so believed in the story, and she had also really loved living in New York City. So she had to leave New York and come back to Screamer Mountain, where she said one time she never wrote another bestseller, but she did write another book. It was supposed to be another novel, but it turned out to be something completely different.
I make my students read Killers of the Dream and watch them get uncomfortable.
In the name of sacred womanhood, of preserving the home, lecherous old men and young ones who had violated the home since they were 16 years old, whipped up lynchings, organized clans, burned crosses, aroused the poor and ignorant to wild excitement by an obscene imagery describing the menace of Negro men, all of whom you would have thought were hiding behind the cypresses, waiting to rape our women.
She argues that what's going on there is that white men would rape black women during slavery, and that while they're raping black women, they would also place white women on a pedestal. In fact, the pedestal will be so far removed from sexuality that the white woman would take on this status as if she's asexual.
And if ever there is a distorted human being, it's the white Southern woman on the pedestal and the men who use that for all kinds of excuses. She saw that the same thing was true in terms of sexuality and gender roles. You know, that this very rigid definition of what a man should be, what a woman should be, all those things are very restrictive.
So this wonderful use of Freudian projection, the Freudian notion of the unconscious and the way in which this is operating in such a powerful and dangerous and violent way.
Killers of the Dream, which should have been an enormous bestseller, just, I think, was too tough for the time. Plus, we're in a sort of wartime and then post-war. Wartime, nobody wants to get yelled at about race. And immediately post-war, nobody wants to get yelled at about race because everybody was too busy trying to make life ordinary again and make all of their relationships fit the old patterns again, because that's where security and comfort lay.
If you've ever been in one of our southern states, you may have taken a sightseeing trip just as this family. A trip to see one of the plantation homes that were built before the Civil War. This beautiful mansion is one of many homesteads that were once the residences of Southern planters. These homes were centers of plantation life. Inside the mansion, we can get some idea of the luxuries that a wealthy plantation family enjoyed. The planter and his slaves were part of an unusual class system. The sharp division of people into two main groups, the owners and the slaves, left a lasting influence on the society of the South. Today, if we visit a social gathering in the South, we'll see some of these influences. The traditional Southern hospitality, the gentle manners and courtesy, the separation of society into distinct groups, and the relationship of that society.
She's asking people to look at themselves. She's not just talking about Black people. She talks about the psychosis of white supremacy. Her opponents simply said that she was trying to stir up hatred and that she was clearly off base. Lillian Smith has written a new book, and brother, is it a stinker? Talk about your devious demagoguery. Not only is this claptrap, but very badly done claptrap. A woefully unsound book. Miss Smith is a prisoner in the monastery of her own mind. They part ways with her politically, they part ways with her intellectually, they part ways with her emotionally. They don't understand her, and what they think they understand, they do not like, for they see this as a voice calling for change, change which they think is too abrupt, which would be upsetting to the South. In one letter, she wrote a friend that said, "You know, they say I'm dropping bombs on Atlanta."
Lillian was convinced she was being silenced deliberately all over the South. Killers was not well received by critics or newspaper editors. Bookstores would not display it, and her publisher finally just gave up and dropped it. Magazine editors began pigeonholing her just as a race writer.
James Baldwin says there are certain conditions under which we live, under conditions of oppression, under conditions of terror and trauma, where the impossible is the least that we can ask for. So I think that Lillian Smith was asking for the impossible. And why not, right? I mean, if you have people who are suffering, who are being marginalized under Jim Crow and Jane Crow racism, if you have lynching of black bodies, if you have the degradation of black humanity, and you have this white woman who recognizes her complicity with this form of degradation, then I think that what's amazing about Lillian Smith is that she is doing that thing that Baldwin says is the least that we can do. She is doing the impossible. In fact, she is herself modeling what we all should do.
The Supreme Court is due to make a decision pretty soon, Sarah, on segregation in the schools. Now, how do you, Georgians, think that decision is going to go?
Anything the Supreme Court does to thwart or change our present system of state control of our educational systems will be the most difficult thing that we in the southern states have had to approach or deal with since the war between states. Now, the white people in the South and also the Negroes in the South want it left alone, just like it is. You agitators, white and colored, want to change it.
This is a woman who, when the Brown decision comes down and few leaders in the South are willing to publicly embrace it and applaud the court, Lillian Smith declares that the Brown decision is the Magna Carta for every child.
And she writes what she herself says is the only time she wrote a tract, meaning she wrote, specifically for a purpose to say, now is the time to act. We can do this. The Supreme Court decision can be obeyed. Also, she ties in the results of the studies on children with different physical abilities. And that takes that Supreme Court decision much farther than most people were thinking.
I think that we have, to a great extent, lost our basic freedom to speak out what we think and what we believe, or to teach it. And I think that we have lost an even more important freedom, and that is the freedom to do right, to listen to our own private conscience instead of listening to the conscience of the demagogue, or the conscience of the mob, or the conscience of hysterical crowds.
Lillian Smith, thank you very much for your views this morning. We appreciate it. Miss Lillian Smith, the well-known author, talking about this subject of integration.
We should be asking for the impossible. We should be demanding of whites, in this case, to look at their prejudices, to be honest about their racism, to remove those masks. So for those who say that she was being unrealistic, I would say that Lillian Smith was being all too realistic. Realistic in describing the gravitas of white supremacy, and realist in describing what it will take, the level of honesty and the profound acts of love and self-sacrifice that are necessary to overturning that system of oppression.
Lillian was diagnosed with cancer in the early 50s. Yeah, in those days, cancer was still considered to be pretty much a death sentence.
She's facing her own mortality. She's had radical mastectomy. It returns, and then she's writing the journey, and she's trying to find out what she really believes.
Several times we were told that she might not make it, but then she would seem to be clear of it before it reasserted itself. And during that time, she would do these things like go to India and write another book and so forth. So she made a wonderful use extension of her life.
The journey in which she explored her own life using psychological insights was very confusing to people. Confusing because she dealt with issues like fear and self-doubt, and the reviewers just didn't know what to do with it. Now, this was the kind of writing, though, that drew in other adventurous and inquiring intellectuals and writers like Pauli Murray, who was just captivated by the journey. In fact, there were passages that she loved to read over and over again, passages about how if one succumbed to it, fear could become disabling.
I went on this journey to answer for myself a few questions. What are our most human qualities? What sets us apart from animal and machine, from the masters and the monster? How can we believe in our infinite possibilities when our limitations are so conspicuous? And hope. What is this stubborn thing in man that keeps him forever picking the lock of time, that drives him to measure his puny size against the unknown and win? What I sought, of course, was something to believe in, something that intelligence and heart can accept, something that can fuse past and present, and art and science and God and oneself into a purposeful whole. A few of my questions were never answered. Others changed into new questions, for I changed as I went along.
It's very difficult to overestimate how important her voice was in the Southern milieu of race that was out here at the time. I don't think there's anybody else who could top her. Primarily because she was writing about it. You know, she was bringing it forward in prose, excellent prose. It was reassuring for young college kids like me to know that there were white people who were willing to go against the tide and articulate that the blessings of liberty, justice, and freedom ought to cover people of color too. There weren't that many white people who were reinforcing our views. They were on the other side. Get back, stand back, you know, what have you.
Lillian Smith was one of the keynote speakers at one of our conferences during the student movement days. And I remember a story that she told about an experience that she had along with her brother. They were playing in the backyard, and they were on this child game of treasure hunting. And lo and behold, they came across a buried trunk, and they started digging, and lo and behold, the trunk was full of money. So they rushed off to the store and put the money on the counter. The store owner, the clerk, says, "You can't buy anything with this money. This is Confederate money You cannot buy anything with this money. And then Lillian Smith said, the nation, the South, is trying to buy its future with outdated Confederate dollar bills.
Martin Luther King's home phone number was written in pencil on the wall beside the phone in the kitchen.
He was arrested, you know all this about it. He was arrested when he had her in the car.
King was driving Lillian to the hospital when he got pulled over by the police. Now, it was probably because he was driving with a white woman in the front seat, but what they said, it was because he had an expired tag. The traffic conviction came up a few months later when King was arrested during the Atlanta student movement and charged with violating his probation. He was put in jail in DeKalb County, and in the middle of the night, they snuck him out and sent him to one of the most dangerous prisons in Georgia, down in Roosevelt. Once this happened, with the presidential election only a month away, the Kennedys began to work behind the scenes for his release.
Well, I owe a great debt of gratitude to Senator Kennedy and his family for this.
At one point, the king that spoke of agape love said that, I'm sorry to say that the vast majority of white people in the United States are racist, either consciously or unconsciously. So I would think that Lillian Smith, given her work in whether it's Killers of the Dream or Strange Fruit, King would have recognized in Lillian Smith an ally, a white ally, who was not just rhetorically committed, but who put her life on the line, who was capable of being stigmatized and being ostracized. And I think this is the kind of courage that Martin Luther King was looking for. This is the kind of courage that he appreciated.
There were times when even the memories, rich as most of them are, didn't seem reason enough for staying on our mountain. Twice it was swept by mysterious fires, one of which destroyed irreplaceable manuscripts and notes. But with the courage she has also demonstrated in a long fight against cancer, Lillian Smith stayed on, uncompromising in her protest. Commercially, she has never approached the success of Strange Fruit. Many an old friendship has been shattered beyond repair. The fashionable description of her was outcast. But there is none of the martyr in Lillian Smith. Her humor alone would make that unthinkable.
And what has happened in the South that has disturbed me so, Strange Fruit disturbed them, but they read it. They all read it. And then came Killers of the Dream, which deeply disturbed them. And they tried not to read that. Now, since then, I have gradually and slowly been accepted. And now I am the sweet little lady who has done so much about race relations, and we don't have to read her books at all because they aren't even interesting. Now, that is an acceptance I call death, you see, death to the writer. Death comes to the writer when people stop reading her books.
For Lil, I mean, there was no strong barrier between her life as activist and her life as artist, as writer. The line between them was a very permeable membrane. I mean, one just flowed into the other. So not to be recognized as an artist was very painful.
She wrote memoir, which reads like a novel. And one of the things that reviewers frequently say about memoirs now, at least best-selling memoirs, is that they read like novels. And Lillian Smith did that long ago. She was a writer who was grounded in psychological insights.
She said, sometimes I get just so sick and tired of the only thing they want to talk to me about is race.
She wasn't in the thick of things. She wasn't in Washington.
No longer notorious, no longer the best-selling author, probably considered somewhat eccentric and maybe lost in the shuffle.
She was cantankerous enough to kind of fight with people. I mean, she fought with people in the NAACP, and she got grumpy at other activists. And she just wasn't willing to play the be nice publicity game. She was uncompromising. And I think uncompromising artists and uncompromising activists don't always get famous and celebrated.
But she was still as active as she could be and as engaged and committed as she could possibly be to the things that she felt were right.
She never stops writing, speaking, taking every opportunity and say what she can about what's going on. I don't think she was ever looking only just entirely at the Deep South, but she really sees this movement for social justice and breaking up of empires. But she says wherever they are, what people are really asking for is to be seen as human beings. She's speaking globally as well as locally.
She just had worn herself out, so her last thing to control was her funeral. She set out very specific things she wanted to happen. She didn't want her family to watch her being put into the grave.
The lines on her tombstone are from the journey. She says, I want my mind to cover the whole globe, but I want my roots to stay here on home ground.
It took grace under pressure, Murray told the audience, for astronauts to brave the unknown and open a new frontier, for James Meredith to enroll as the first Black student at the University of Mississippi under military guard, for Rosa Parks to refuse to give up her seat to white passengers knowing that she would be arrested, and for Lillian Smith to write about the psychosis of white supremacy and align herself with the civil rights movement. As women of conscience, Murray told the audience, we have the responsibility of carrying on the great pioneering tradition of the valiant women who have gone before.
I can end with one more thing. I think that what is so important about Lillian Smith's work is, as we are existing within the 21st century, under our current moment of white nativism, neo-fascism, and authoritarianism. And I think that Lillian Smith's work is utterly indispensable at this moment. Killers of the Dream and Strange Fruit, those texts are calling to us in this moment of moral crisis around the question of white supremacy. And Lillian Smith's voice says to us, it says, you as white people need to come to terms with your whiteness. You, as I've done, despite the fact that it was much earlier in American history, but this racism has reconfigured itself. It continues to exist in a different instantiation. In many ways, Lillian Smith's voice is absolutely indispensable as we tackle white supremacy, neo-fascism, and white authoritarianism in the manifestation and in the embodiment of Donald Trump.
If you got maximum participation of all the respective interest groups in the political process, you probably would have a far more progressive South. But as long as you have millions of African Americans throughout the South who can register but who are not registered, and on top of that, if you also have several 100,000 Hispanics who could register because they're citizens, but who have not done it, you are essentially supporting through your inaction the old slave regime. But you can't do it with marches. It's hard work, but it's more than just registration, it's education about why it's important to register and vote. And then you gotta have a mechanism for getting out your vote. For those people who say that voting doesn't matter, if it doesn't matter, then why is it that most white people vote? if it doesn't matter.